You're on mute.
Could you hear me now? So I'm Sam Cruz. I was born and raised in Sunset Park, Brooklyn. I am a pastor there at Trinity Lutheran Church on 46th and 4th Avenue. I am also Associate Professor of Religion and Society at Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan. I am very happy to be here today in solidarity with all those who are struggling against hatred and oppression of anyone who seems or appears to be different. I bring my sister Rebecca with me today. She died in 1995 of AIDS, when many people in Sunset Park were dying of AIDS. And I've never seen her death as simply a biological illness or physical illness. I see it partially as a result of the violence and racism and hatred that this society has had against Latino people and all people of color.
I apologize. I am totally going to butcher your name. Please correct me. Moumita?
Moumita. No, Moumita. Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Moumita Ahmed. I founded the Queens Mutual Aid Network. My pronouns are she and her. I'm also a candidate running for city council in Queens. In lieu of International Women's Day, I want to honor all of the revolutionary women in my life, including sis here, Linda Sarsour, and people like my mother, who is a granddaughter, who is the daughter of a revolutionary. And I want to take this moment to also honor all of the working class women who have been at the front lines of this pandemic. That includes our Asian American sisters and brothers who are facing immense discrimination, which as a Muslim woman, I understand and recognize the trauma and, people like my parents, they give me the resilience and our community actually, their resilience is what drives me to continue to fight for working class people, fight against the billionaire interests, right? And fight for a more just economy.
Thank you for that. Kay?
Peace, everybody. My name is Key. I use he or they pronouns. I am based currently in Queens, New York. Recently moved to Queens, but lifelong born and raised New Yorker. So here, I'm a co-founding member of Black Lives Matter Global Network, and also a member of Movement Net Lab, which is a think, practice, tank, and we really focus on developing emerging social movements, and have done a lot of work with local movements here and also nationally, right? I think I'm bringing in today, I think 2 people specifically, Octavia Butler, who just had her name on the landing, right? Which I know there's a lot of feelings about that, but I think it's everything that she would have wanted in terms of a space explorer, right? And a dreamer about what's possible. And then secondly, I think I'm gonna bring in Blake Brockington, who was a young Black trans man who suffered from mental illness and passed away this year, this month, a few years ago. And he has just really been on my heart and my mind as Black trans people struggle with their, mental illness, but also the material conditions that we live in, right? And so those are 2 people dear to my heart right now. And so I think I just want to bring them into this conversation. Peace.
Thank you for that. I really appreciate it. We also have Emerald.
Hello, I'm so sorry. Just having a little bit of technical difficulties, but thank you for having me here. I'm Emma Gardner, the youngest daughter of Eric Gardner. I'm out here in New York City. The tragedy that happened to my father was 2014, and we've been fighting for social justice ever since, my family and I.
Thank you for that. We also have Rabbi Stanton.
I am Joshua Stanton, and he, him, his. I'm a congregational rabbi in Manhattan who lives in Brooklyn, and I am on the advisory board of the New Sanctuary Coalition. I am here in solidarity not only with the Asian and Asian American communities, but also with the many congregants who are Asian and Jewish. And anti-Asian hatred is not an issue of them. It is an issue of people attacking us and people in my house of worship. I also feel particular resonance with this moment of hatred and bigotry. Modern anti-Semitism really emerged during the bubonic plague in Europe. And it's the first time that Jews were not only racialized in a way that feels familiar, but were associated with plague and illness in a way that really continued in a continuous thread until the Holocaust. So when a community is targeted on the basis of heritage of any sort in a time of pandemic, I, as a Jewish leader, take it very seriously. And I do so in honor of a friend and classmate, Dr. Paul Chung, a sociologist who is the first person who introduced into my vocabulary the idea of racial triangulation, the idea of model minority identity being foisted upon you, and who began to teach me about the similarities as well as the significant differences of the Asian community in the United States in comparison to the Jewish community in the United States.
Thank you for that. And last but certainly not least, we have Diana Morales, who's on the line. If you could both introduce yourself, but also welcome us with your remarks, and then we can jump right into the discussion.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Jamira, for opening for us. And thank you all for being here today. I am deeply honored and humbled to have you here. Diane Morales, ella, she, her. I want to just, if I can participate in the exercise as well, I am bringing with me and invoking into this space all of the women in my family that have come before me, in particular, my grandmother, Manuela Rosa, who made the journey from Puerto Rico to New York City with her 12-year-old daughter without being able to speak a word of English because she believed in the promise of opportunity that New York City held. And she happens to also have been the person who I called mommy in my life, who I shared a room and a bed with until the day that I left home for college. So everything that I do is in honor of her and her footsteps. It is, you know, I don't want to talk too long about me or who I am. I am running for mayor of New York City. I think that this is a critical time for us for so many reasons, for so many crises that we have navigated and are struggling with. But I also think this is an important time for us to come together in solidarity to really elevate and reclaim our communities and the safety of our communities, and recognize, most importantly, that the violence that so many communities are experiencing right now is actually a part of a larger systemic anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and so many other phobias that are designed to really divide us and to separate us. And the idea of recognizing that solidarity and our ability to move forward and be safe is tied to the fates of each other and one another, I think is critical at this point in time, and recognizing that oppression and white supremacy are the sort of master tool that is being wielded to divide us and to, to cause our communities further violence and harm. We've all been targeted. We've all been subjected to these forces, if you will. And I really looking forward to this call to action in solidarity and this coalition that we are building of mutual support to create a safer city and a safer society for us all. So I'm honored and privileged that you all have agreed to spend time with us today. And I'm really, really looking forward to this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And I really appreciate you pointing that out, that this is, if we notice about how communities, particularly marginalized communities, are treated, we know that these are interconnected. Both the problem and the solution cannot be done in silos, which is why we have such a diverse group of stakeholders a part of this conversation. And so I encourage each of the panelists to please jump in, add your thoughts. We want to have a robust conversation for those who are listening at home, and to remind you all that the conversation didn't start here and it won't end here. It's really hopefully allows all of us to spark new ideas, to address the root causes of the problem, and to call those out who continues to find avenues in which to oppress communities of color. So with that being said, I want to jump into the first question that we have. It's really important to recognize that the attacks on the Asian American community is not new, even though it feels new. And the reason why it feels new is because finally the mainstream media is talking about it. But xenophobia isn't new. And I'm curious for our Asian brothers and sisters that are on this panel, if we could talk a little bit about how the current climate has particularly impacted your community, and what are some of the issues that you see are bubbling up to the surface so far? And any one of you can feel free to jump in.
I can start and then we'll build off that. I think in our community, my specific community, like the Vietnamese community, we're angry, we're sad. I'm personally angry and sad because I love our people and I want to keep our people safe. Not just for this moment, but for good. But every single time there's an act of anti-Asian violence, as it's labeled, I'm always worried and wonder how we will be used against to advance a pro-police agenda. Because if we're talking specifically about the Vietnamese community, we have for a very long time been the very victims of police violence and ICE. And as I'm talking right now, we're working to fight to keep some of our community members here in the United States and not be deported back to Vietnam. And so it is something where with the heightened mainstream media coverage, I'm always resistant to labeling something as like a hate crime, because that almost always puts the bullseye on our Black community members, instead of like looking at it as a whole of like, this is a symptom of a bigger problem, and that is white supremacy that is putting us in under-resourced, over-policed communities.
Jason, you wanted to jump in?
Okay, sure. I wasn't sure, maybe others are unmuting. I think what I would just say is that I think that, we know this is not new. And if you're here on this town hall, there's this level of understanding and care and attention that you have to anti-racism and commitment to that. I think many of us understand, and we hear it in the news that this is also a product of the rhetoric from the Trump administration. But I also want us to dig deeper than just Trump as an individual bad actor. Although I think that we do need to hold people in power and elected officials accountable for the kind of rhetoric and discourse that they participate in and reinforce. What are the forces that led to the Trump administration? What are the forces that led to 70+ million people voting for him when he ran on a campaign of racism, racism against multiple communities, transphobia, xenophobia. And so this is just a starting point in the conversation, but I want to just acknowledge that, these are things that go much deeper. And so we have to move beyond just the acknowledgement of interpersonal racial bias, which is real, interpersonal discrimination, which is real. There's a visceral reaction that we have when that occurs. It is deeply painful when we witness that, when we lose people, when our communities are suffering. But I also want to encourage us to go deeper. What are the conditions that produced that violence? And how do we address those root causes of that violence? So this is bigger than Trump. This is bigger than individual people who hurt other people in our communities. And so I want to start us off there.
That's a really great point, Jason. And I want to see if anyone else wants to jump in, because to your point, if we focus on just the bad actors in the moment, we forget about the systematic ways in which these conditions are created by design and has been around for so long. So I'm curious if anyone wants to tag team and jump in on that point before we, yes, Fred?
Yeah, I think that that's a really important point to bring into the conversation so that we understand the reality of what we're dealing with, right? Donald Trump, Mitch McConnell, everyone, perpetrating and perpetuating some of these issues are symptoms of a condition that's as old as the country itself. So for us to have true, systemic, true, deep change, we need to understand the intersectionality of our cause, and I just want to bring that into the space very much is understanding that there's a through line, from the moment that people landed in Virginia to the January 6th insurrection, right? All of our issues are deeply shared because of that. So I hope that we definitely talk about that more.
Yeah, Linda, if I can bring you in, because, it would be remiss for us all to pretend that you have not been both individually kind of targeted by institutions, but also for your religion, for being a woman. And I'm curious, as a native of New York, how have you seen that perpetuated over time? And as we think about what are the large scale solutions, how do you see your voice and the voices of other marginalized communities important to the struggle in order for us to address that work?
Thank you, Jamira. I think one of the things I think about and reflect as I hear all my family members here speaking is that it reminds me of one of the principles of Kingian nonviolence: attack the forces of evil, not those doing evil. We would be misguided to believe that transphobia, Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, anti-Asian violence or discrimination happened because of Donald Trump. It has been manifested in this country since the days of its founding. We would be remiss not to talk about the Chinese Exclusion Act. We would be remiss to talk about the internment of Japanese Americans. And it's one of the reasons why when we as Americans are bystanders to these types of injustice, it happens again. When Donald Trump stood up and announced the Muslim ban, he announced it because he knew that he could do that, because we have done this as a nation. We have codified discrimination against people from different parts of the world, and now are targeting Muslims and those of African descent. And so for me, as someone who started my organizing in the backdrop of 9/11, which was a horrific attack on our nation, 3,000 of our fellow Americans were murdered on that day. And the response that our country had, instead of figuring out how to move forward and heal as a nation, we decided to target our Muslim neighbors. We decided to bring every single law enforcement agency and even create new ones, so that we could come and target communities. I came into this work from watching NYPD intelligence and FBI raid entire apartment buildings in New York. I actually watched men walk out of their apartment buildings, lay down on the sidewalk with big guns pointed to their heads and their children crying, watching them from the windows. And so for me, I want to make sure that people put this in context, that we are not to blame everything about Donald Trump. We have to understand that we live in a country that has systems that must be dismantled, and that our Asian communities are often pinned up against other communities. And I appreciate that comment. I remember the story of the murder of Akai Gurley in New York, in Brooklyn, by an Asian cop. And there was a big divide that happened amongst some elements of the Asian community who wanted to defend the officer who was Asian at the time. I can't remember his name. Peter Liang was his name. And there were many young Asian Americans who stood up within their own community to say, we will not stand here and defend a police officer in our community who murdered a Black man. We're not going to do that. And that beautiful, courageous conversation that started happening within the Asian community was so beautiful to watch and see that kind of solidarity. And so for me as a Muslim American, and as someone who's been targeted by hate, not just online, but physically, on people who have I have security outside of my house. I've had to change my children's last names. I had to do a whole lot of things to protect my family. So I know what it feels like. And I know that other communities understand. I just want our Asian American communities to know that we got their back. And I remember this one quote, and I'll end with this. It's a quote by an Aboriginal woman that I keep in all my notebooks. It's on every wall that I have in my house when I'm at my office. And it says, whoops, my phone just fell. And it says, if you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you have come here because you believe that your liberation is bound up with mine, let us work together. So we are not each other's saviors. I'm not here to save Asian Americans. I'm not here to save Black people. I truly believe that my liberation is bound up with the liberation of others. And so when one of our communities is not free, none of us are free. And so I look forward to working towards liberation for us all.
That's a really great point, and I appreciate you bringing in that quote. It's one of my favorite as well. Rohan, I want to turn to you because as you mentioned in your introduction, you sit at the intersection of a number of communities, particularly in this conversation, both the Asian and the Black community. And I'm curious if you could tell us a little bit more about your experience and what do you see about this moment addressing violence against the Asian community while also coming off of the continuous violence against the Black community here in New York?
Yeah, thank you so much for that. I would like to first piggyback a little bit off of what Linda was saying when she referred to the Asian American communities as being pinned up. And there's this ongoing theme in our communities, or this ongoing understanding that Asian American communities have very often, time and time again, been sort of constructed as like a scapegoat, sort of constructed as this sort of a, if it's unethical to target this one community, we can target this other community simply because we are rendered invisible. Our experiences are invisibilized, as Connie Wynn from AAPI Women Lead puts it. And I feel like for me, what's happening right now is a lot of Black and Asian communities are being pitted against each other, such as calling for these, more policing or more ways to violently control our communities. All of our communities are experiencing mass and trauma. And for me, it's also not only that the Asian American communities are being scapegoated, but also this sort of pinning everything on very recent rhetoric, pinning things on Asian Americans, as well as Donald Trump or other specifically white men who have very explicit vitriol of hatred. It's also a way for white society to avoid accountability for the long systemic centuries which they benefit from that have resulted in mass killings of Asian Americans. Specifically for myself, in acknowledging Asian Americans who are of brown skin, Asian Americans like myself who are Black as well, there is a consistent auto erasure in our communities. So as white colonial settler culture and society erases narratives of the long history of solidarity between Black and Asian communities because of the current miseducation in our current climate, I am experiencing a lot of times where people like myself are completely erased from the narrative. And so while there is this consistent erasure of our own stories, our own history, we are in fact limiting our own power. We are limiting the intersectional power that Black, Asian, Indigenous, and Latinx communities can share.
You clearly have read the questions because you led us right into the next topic. And I appreciate that because, when I moved to New York, I always remember people talking about how, they refer to the US being a melting pot, but that New York is really the manifestation of that melting pot. You have so many different people from so many walks of life living within this city, but yet there are communities that are divided. because of this mounting tension around violence, both within our community, but also violence that is perpetrated against us by law enforcement. And so I'm curious for those on the line, what needs to shift about our policy making and our collective organizing in order for us to address both the violence that is being perpetrated against us, while also recognizing that how we got here impacts us differently, and what does justice mean for our community looks very differently depending on who you're talking to. And actually, I want to start with Diane first, because she is running for office, and because, you know, this is very much a policy question, but then I would love to open it up to everyone else to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Jamira. I mean, I think, you know, to tie this to everything everyone else has been talking about in terms of really not focusing just on the current sort of instances or circumstances or symptoms, but really taking it back to from whence all of this has begun. I think it's critical to think about and make the connections around policing and its roots, right? And the idea that policing is a modern day, you know, the modern day iteration or the evolution of the original slave patrols, and what the intent and purpose was, in fact, of those slave patrols, which was not, in fact, to protect life, but to protect property that belonged to property, i.e. the Black people, the slaves that belonged to the white slave owners, right? And so, you know, the idea that we can even begin from that premise and talk about the sort of modern day evolution of that institution and try to talk about how we might tinker around the edges to bring safety to communities is fundamentally, and by that I mean at the root, flawed. Which is why, you know, my platform from day one has called for the radical transformation of that institution and the divesting from that. We need to, you know, reclaim and redefine what public safety really is for our communities. And what we know is that what leads to safety is the provision of and the addressing of the basic human needs that people have: housing, access to healthcare, access to food. The things that people need to be able to live in dignity are in fact the things that are directly connected and tied to people being able to live safely. And so, you know, this kind of misinterpretation, misdirection, misconception of policing as the thing that we need, right, is directly tied to white supremacy. It's directly tied to, you know, the origins of this country in slavery. And we need to move away from that premise so that we can actually begin to provide for our communities in the ways that they need to be safe. And part of that also means, I think for many of us, I know that I have conversations with lots of elders in the Black and Brown community that are caught up with the idea that we need police to be safe, right? And so, you know, that has become something that we have internalized. And I was just on a call earlier today where there was a reference to the riffraff. And you know what they're seeing in their mind's eye when they say that, right? So the reclaiming of that so that we are starting from the beginning with our people and recognizing that our communities need to come together in terms of reimagining what safety is and moving away from this model of policing. And that's what, you know, I've called for that. I've called for a divesting in policing in year one by $3 billion and a reinvestment in our communities to address some of the things that our communities really and truly need to be safe. And so I think that's the first step from a policy perspective in reinvesting in our communities in a whole different kind of way.
Thank you. And Ms. Ahmed, you are running for a city council. I'm curious for you, what do you hope is the shift around policy that you're hoping to bring to the table that will allow us to reimagine what justice looks like for different communities?
Yeah, thank you. Everything Diane said, I absolutely agree with. And, actually what Rabbi Stanton was saying when he mentioned that the Jewish community faced anti-Semitism after the bubonic plague or during, if you also look at throughout our history, after every plague, there has been a rise of some sort of discrimination. In fact, the other day I was reading something about in Honolulu, and entire Chinatown was just burnt down after an epidemic. And so this is actually a surge in ethnic discrimination is quite common. And so it's so important for us to recognize why this happens. And some of it is also misinformation, right? So it's really, really important for us to recognize that. And in terms of policy, provide language accessibility and work with community leaders and recognize the diversity of Asian Americans who exist, instead of just lumping us into these, like, you know, model minority groups or just like one giant group, and investing in time and money to talk to community folks, to come to hire people, right, that from our communities to coordinate with each other. One of the things that I dealt with in my district was during the pandemic, there was immense misinformation, and that led to more and more people contracting the virus, making our district effectively a red zone. And that is because there was a slow response team to actually come to our community and work with us and provide language accessible information to prevent these things. And, you know, and during that misinformation, people even from our communities, not just like that, were saying things like, oh, don't eat Chinese food, right? Like, and people were saying things like that. And why? It's because that misinformation, when you wait too long, that happens. And so we need to address that. And part of it is actually diversifying our government and diversifying our leadership, so that and that hiring folks and bringing in community leaders who are on a grassroots level doing work with the community.
Thank you for that. And Rabbi Stanton, I'm curious, you know, you mentioned, and Ms. Ahmed just reiterated, like the fact that we know diseases and viruses are inevitable to happen over time, but not the weaponization of how those diseases impacts our community comes from the government. And so from your point of view, how can we shift the balance of power and really address policy and culture differently, recognizing that this is going to happen again, but how do we prevent the government from weaponizing it against a marginalized community?
So to provide a framework, and I apologize, this is stuff that shakes me to my core. In the middle of the 1300s, when the bubonic plague was really at its apex in Europe, this is the first time that Jews were described as disease vectors, basically vermin, rats, causes of disease. It was the first time that Jews were rounded up and entire communities were burnt alive. And so it was a direct and even in methodology, very resonant with the Holocaust. And the language that Nazis used was not dissimilar from the language that was used about Jews in the 1300s. So I want to be very explicit about what happened historically and why this matters so deeply as a moment of solidarity. It's very clear that in moments of pandemic, which are so much bigger than any group or any person, there is a desperation to scapegoat, to understand that which is fundamentally incomprehensible. And what we've seen in the last couple of months is that it can be really helpful to respond to the incomprehensible with reason and logic about that which we do understand. We don't understand the origins of this pandemic, but we do know that vaccines can help. We don't understand what the long-term economic impacts are going to be, but we do know that direct assistance to individuals can help them a great deal in this moment. And so what's been fascinating to see, and the contrast could not be more stark in the last 8 weeks as opposed to the prior 4 years, is just how rational, sensible, calm policy can really diffuse a situation that became very much about individuals and scapegoating and blame. And it also seems very clear that scapegoating happens when you don't have a rational policy. So I think for so many reasons, this is exactly the right forum for the conversation, because we need to start talking policy solutions that will help communities that are hurting terribly in this moment, so that they do not revert to their basest instincts and start blaming and targeting Asian Americans or other groups. And so public policy, can be a profoundly effective answer to scapegoating and hate.
And to your point, when we started this forum, we talked about the idea of humanity, seeing each other's humanity and policy being rooted in that. And so I'm curious, Pastor Cruz, when we talk about seeing each other's humanity and really thinking about a collective strategy that will benefit everyone and not throw anyone under the bus, I'm curious from your perspective in your work, what have you seen that will enable for us to see each other's humanity as we develop policies and practices to move our city forward?
Well, there's several things. Let me begin by saying that to address some of that, I think anyone who has any type of leadership has to really stand up and make clear where they stand and condemn these issues of hate. I was very inspired by the fact that Pope Francis was in Iraq. I looked at some of the, he's not there because there's 0.5% of the population is Christian. He's there, he's sending a message. I don't look at the people of Iraq the way most people in the United States and throughout some parts of the world look at them. They're beautiful, wonderful people. But the images we see of destroyed buildings, we want to blame all that on ISIS when it was George Bush who bombed the hell out of the country. So we need to start speaking up. And that leads me to what I was thinking about in terms of humanity, how complicated and sophisticated the apparatus of oppression is, in that I was thinking that we cannot allow ourselves to adopt white liberal policies that seem progressive and are not. Let me just give you an example. You hear people, you know, maybe some are well-intentioned, white liberals, I call it white liberals with all due respect to white people. I like some of them too. They say, what we need is not to divest from the police. We need to invest money, and I apologize if any of you have used this, to have social workers go with the police so when somebody has a mental issue, they could deal with it. You don't have to be a social worker to stop from killing somebody who doesn't deserve to be killed. But you see the subtlety in that? It's like, it's not that the police officer is a racist, it's that he's not well trained. How do you train people not to kill? There's no training for that. The only solution for that is to prosecute them and make sure they get convicted. So we kind of soften things up. Policy is going to have to come from the bottom, from people who are not deceived with this BS from white liberal progressives that doesn't work. We need to really, there are other ways of seeing things, in other words. And I think we have to be, and I guess we are, very aware that the situation is complicated. We don't get to these situations where somebody's face gets slashed on a train, or you have young big men running into elderly Asian people in California and kill them. That's beyond comprehension to me. I don't get it, I don't understand it, but I do know that the apparatus of hatred, of oppression is so deep that people start doing things that seem not to be rational at all. But I think we have to stand up as leaders and make it clear, you know, the Iraqi people, they're not barbaric. That country is not like that because it started off like that. The United States blew the hell out of it. That's why they're still struggling. They're beautiful, wonderful human beings. And I'm glad that the Pope is there, because that's what he's basically saying indirectly. I'm here. These are people like everybody else. And understanding and beware, I would say, of white progressive ideas. I mean, to finish, I always say that New York City calls itself a sanctuary city, right? Sounds nice. I'm for completely 100% for supporting undocumented people, but it's not a sanctuary to working class citizens. Everybody's moving out. You can't live here in New York City. So it's a way of progressive, white progressive ideology. I mean, de Blasio, not to bring up politics, is the biggest gentrifier of all the mayors we've had in recent years. And unfortunately, one of the people that it's running from his administration seems to be in the same type of support. But my point is, that words sound nice, sanctuary city, not a sanctuary to the members of my church. They're all struggling, renting out rooms. If you live in New York, you know what's happening. People are renting out to strangers so they could pay their rent. So we need it to be a sanctuary for everyone and not some illusory idea that comes from white progressive ideology. Thank you.
Thank you. And Carolina and Jason, the pastor just talked about this idea of humanity and this idea of sanctuary cities for those who live here, grew up here, and call New York home. Do you feel, or have you felt like the city has been a sanctuary city for you? And what will you think will allow other communities, or this country for that matter, if not the city, to start seeing the Asian community through the lens of humanity, especially as we watch incidents of elderly folks being thrown into poles by white men and just the continuous attack on the Asian community?
I can go first. So, I mean, there's so much to unpack here, and I think that there's a lot of pain and that needs to be acknowledged. I think we're also only offered policing in prisons as the only solution to that. And so I want to address that because there's limited time, and I feel like I have to address this point, that we spend over $10 billion a year on the NYPD. That doesn't even take into account the budget for the Department of Corrections. We have spent billions and billions and billions of dollars for decades on policing. That has not stopped any of the anti-Asian violence that we are now experiencing today. And so I think that we have to really ask ourselves, what is the way in which we can actually address the violence? How do we actually stop the violence? It's not going to be through policing, because that's never actually happened. And our communities as Asian Americans in this country have never had justice through policing and have never had justice through the criminal legal system. And so I'm also thinking about Vincent Chin, who was killed in 1982 by white auto workers. There was no justice for Vincent Chin. There's no justice for Asian Americans, this year who've been killed by police violence. I'm thinking about Christian Hall. I'm thinking about Angelo Quinto. I'm thinking about all the other people who have been killed by police violence who are Asian American. And so I think that as we're having this conversation, I want to address the point around policing, that policing is not the answer. It's never been the answer. It's never kept us safe. And so I also want us to start thinking about what does keep our community safe. And so to Diane's point earlier around defunding the police, we need to be clear about what that means. It's not about taking away resources. It's not about taking away safety. It's actually about investing in communities so we can be safe. And if you care about Asian American communities, if we want to acknowledge that Asian Americans have some of the highest poverty in the city, in this country, if we want to acknowledge that Asian communities are suffering during this pandemic, well, there are things that we can actually do to support our communities. We can invest in community-based organizations that provide culturally responsive and language accessible services. We can support organizations that are trying to support people and connecting them to healthcare services when they've lost their jobs. We can support the workers who are losing their jobs, including the unionized workers from the Jingfang restaurant in Chinatown, right? And so when we talk about supporting small business, well, what about those workers too? And so I want to broaden also the conversation around what safety looks like for Asian American communities, and to tie that to other kind of struggles, because addressing violence in the way that the media wants to talk about is not going to be easy. It's not something we can just do with the snap of a finger or sign a piece of legislation and it's over. But the kind of struggles that we're committed to are going to take time, energy, it's relationship building. These are things that they're just so much bigger than the question of, do we need more policing or not? And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Jason. I want to point out that I am not a natural born New Yorker. I've been in New York for about 10 years now, but I was born and raised in North Carolina. I know some New Yorkers say that after 10 years, you're a New Yorker, kind
You
of.
pay taxes, right?
I pay taxes. I feel that I feel like it. But I want to like point out, like, my family was relocated after they were refugees. They were labeled as refugees because our country was bombed to kingdom come, back to the Stone Age, as a politician said. Like, in the span of the years of the Vietnam War, I think it was over 2 million tons of bombs were dropped in Laos alone. Like, to this day, it is 2021. There are people in Laos, Vietnam, Cambodia who are still dying from being stepped on landmines and bombs that were not activated. So the effects of the US imperialist war machine is happening. We feel it today. And to talk about policing, we need to talk, like what Jason was saying earlier, is like, what does our community need to feel safe? And I think about where I'm from, a working class family. I worked paycheck to paycheck in the restaurant up until the pandemic. And when the pandemic shut everything down, we had nothing. And there was this span of time where I was really afraid because I didn't have any savings. But then unemployment kicked in and I was able to get that because I'm a citizen. The rest of my colleagues who are undocumented were not so lucky. And so it came to going, well, how do I help the guy who's the bar back, who is now taking care of his family, but doesn't have the money to take care of his family and can't go find a job, can't collect unemployment like I do. And then we see how, a year ago, there were about, I would say, like 5 to 10 community fridges. Right now, we have over 100 community fridges, and we have a lot of mutual aid networks like South Brooklyn Mutual Aid, Queens Mutual Aid, Bed-Stuy Strong, who have stepped up to provide like a little safety network for our community members, but they shouldn't have to. And I think about, like, if we're talking about how do we keep our community safe, how do we keep our community safe in the long run? How do we make sure that everyone has what they need in order to survive now? Like, is it food? Is it keeping the electricity? Is it keeping, the kids in school? Like right now, a lot of the kids are now going back to in-person schooling, but for a long time there was a scramble to get kids laptop, internet access. The long-term effects of that we won't see until like the next few years when kids are applying for colleges. And I think about like how the Asian American community is so underrepresented in the arts, and how that's part of the system of like, well, our parents tell us we're not supposed to be an artist, but why? Because it's never been a stable profession. Why are artists being paid poverty wages? Why are artists having to, do like 10 out of 12 rehearsal hours and still don't have like the money for health insurance to take care of childcare? So all of that already eliminates a lot of potential for people to be in the arts field and to be part of the conversation. Like Moumita said earlier about like, how do we have more people running for office? You don't have the time to run for office when you're just trying to make sure that your family is fed. Like, you don't have the time to vote even if you are trying to make sure that your family is fed. So how do we, and like with Jason's, like, how do we take care of the community grassroots organizations that are doing the work? How do we create accessible language? Because I was working on a campaign to get translated language materials for Vietnamese people to fill out the census. And a lot of Vietnamese people are undocumented. And so already they have a distrust of it. And it took so long for us to translate this because nothing was in place for us to get the materials out to the people. And so the fear is now is like, how many people actually got the language materials to fill out the census? And how many are still afraid to fill out the census because of you know, the misinformation that is like, if you fill out the census, ICE is going to come knock at your door. So I'll stop there.
No, I appreciate you bringing all of those different issues because they're all correlated and they're all being used to weaponize to keep our communities the way that they are. You know, I would be remiss to not remind us that we have Key, who's one of the co-founders of the global Black Lives Matter movement on this panel, as well as Emerald, who, you know, we unfortunately watched your father be brutally assassinated on national television. And we started out this summer rooting for the idea of defund the police and divest to invest. I'm curious for the two of you who have been a part of this movement for so long, how does it feel to see us transition within 12 months from divest to reinvest, and from defund the police to now there being calls for police? And to Jason's point, the idea of police are not the answer for how we keep our community safe. And feel free for either of you to start.
Thank you for having me. I am a strong campaign. I do have a strong passion to campaign for laws. As you know, my father's video has been played over 1 million times, and repeatedly, I continue to have to relive that moment. And for me, with dealing with the police, it's all about, you know, the dynamic. So a lot of the times the police officers are brought in from other states. They are not used to our communities. They're not used to our culture. And it's not enough for them just to say, I didn't mean it, or, you know, I thought they had a gun, or I thought that their cell phone was a gun. And it's just like, you know, those excuses are invalid in a case like my father's situation. And the reason why we went so hard for the Eric Gardner Anti-Chokehold Act is because of course, there was a lot of cover up in my father's situation, but they used the fact that the chokehold was banned and not illegal. And that's basically why the police officer got off. And, you know, it's unacceptable that he was fired 5 years later. It's unacceptable that he can pack up his family and move to another state, and he can very well become a police officer where nobody even knows what he's done in New York City. So, in just a couple of days, our Kirsten, I say our because I feel like she's a part of my team. Our Kirsten Gillibrand, she will be presenting the Eric Gardner Anti-Chokehold to the Senate on a federal level. So not only in New York State is it illegal now for the chokehold to be administered by a police officer. Sorry, someone called me. But if it's passed by the Senate, then it would then become a federal law. I'm very strongly campaigning for that. And I think that a lot of organizations and a lot of people, they forget that elected officials are the people who are supposed to be supporting us. We elect them into these offices. And then a lot of the times, a lot of stuff that they say they're going to do, they don't do. So, you know, in the case of Mayor de Blasio, everybody knows, that when he did the Stop and Frisk campaign with his son, as soon as the police turned their back on him, he no longer stood with Stop and Frisk. I mean, he no longer stood with the African-American community. We saw that in the case of all the police brutality cases in New York City. He did not stand with us. He said things, but for me, it's not enough. And I'm sure for the other families of victims of police brutality, it's not enough. And, as we go into candidates and everything for the new mayor of New York City, I would like to see somebody who stands with us publicly. Like, I know that, it's not realistic to say, hey, mayor, fire this person right now, immediately. We can't do that. That's just not a part of law, but a part of that is changing the law. So, and then how we support the communities, not only the Asian communities and the Black Lives Matter communities, the youth are the next generation. And whether you're from the Asian community, the Black community, the Muslim community, you need to be supported. And I think mental health is very important. And, when a situation happens where your victim, your loved one is killed by a police officer, mental health services are not available. If in the case of a Asian American, limited to no mental health services are afforded to the families. And it's like a lot of the times activists come in and they say, hey, we'll help you. But a lot of the times we get left after the cameras go away. So, and then activists go on to make millions of dollars, and we're still standing here struggling, trying to get Medicaid to pay for our mental health services. So we need to fund social justice organizations that support the families, that support us. You know, me, when my father was killed, I was working at Payless, and I had to stand at work and listen to people talk about my father. And, you know, I couldn't really say anything because it's like you say something to them, it turns into a political battle, and then you lose your job. So how do you then support your family? So it's like, you know, we need support. We need boots on the ground. We need mental health services. We need funding. We need childcare. We need support groups. We need grief counseling. All of that stuff is things that we need. And I think that a lot of people forget. Like they see, okay, you lost your loved one and I'm going to advocate for you. And I definitely understand. And I appreciate everyone that's going out there and speak, but don't forget that we have lives too. It's not easy for us to get jobs after we're in the newspaper saying that we got a $7 million lawsuit or $15 million lawsuit. And that lawsuit is being split 17 ways, or in my case, 7 ways. So, you know, the money is just not enough. And sometimes it's not about you know, paying a victim or, you know, all of these things that are going on, but it's like, we don't have money to pay for mental health services right away. We don't have money to pay for childcare while we go to these marches, while we go to these protests. We don't have the funding to do that. So to have that funding means a lot. We want to stand with our Asian community. We want to stand with our African-American community. And we want to come together as low-income communities so that we can build ourselves up. And it's not fair that we just fight for one race, and it's not right. Like, you know, I don't hate all police officers. I absolutely do not hate all police officers, but I have hate in my heart, and I feel like people should respect my feelings. Like, you know, I have feelings. I have the right to feel, and I am mentally hurt. I am mentally broken, and I'm sure that I am not the only person. And to see people come in and say, I will support you, and then I'm still sitting here 6 years later, and they're sitting in big houses, and I'm looking for housing resources, and I'm looking for job resources, and I'm looking for financial resources. And I'm seeing the very same people that say they're going to help me standing on TV looking just fine to me. So it's just one of those things where we must come together. We must support each other. We can't just say defund the police without saying, let's put that money back into the community, and let's talk about the activists who collect money off the back of victims, and the victims never see any of this money. These fundraisers that happen, and the money never comes to the activists. And then for the activists to say, I just want to bring up one point, that one activist who is a part of the Black Lives Matter, I won't say his name, but he sat on a panel and he told a victim who is my friend that she's a sellout because she took a settlement. But then he went on to have a TV show where he got paid, and her image was used, or her husband's image was used, and she didn't make any money off of that. And it's just like, you know, not that she should have made money off of it, but you're using my husband, my father, my sister, my brother, you're using our images where we have to relive it, and you're making money off of going to talk about me. And I'm sitting here with 4 children, 5 children, 6 children, and I'm struggling. So I just say all of this to say that we need to support the victims first, and then we can support the activists and the communities that want to support us, because we are the story, and we're the people who are suffering and struggling the most. And I will always stand with my victims before I stand with people who say they want to advocate for the victims. So it's like, you know, we have to support each other. And a part of supporting each other is making sure that we have the necessary resources, that we have the proper support. I just found out that one of the women, Miss Pamela Brooks, her son was Amir Brooks, who was killed while riding his bike and being chased by the police. She's a grief counselor. I think that there should be funding for her to do grief counseling for victim services. I mean, for victims and survivors. And she just does not have that. And it's just like, I didn't know she was a grief counselor. So I'm like, I'm going to call you a couple of days a week to talk. And she's opened that communication to talk to me. And it's just like, a lot of people don't know. But then they see higher up activists out there that are like, yeah, I'm standing for you. But she's also standing for us too. So she should get the same type of platform, priority, recognition, accolades. She should get the same thing, because she's still doing the same work that take up space, but that's definitely what I wanted to share. And it's just like, if we're gonna talk about all of it, if we're gonna hold police officers who kill police officers and people who victimize our loved ones accountable, we should hold ourselves accountable as a Black community to find out where the money is going and how it's going to help the victims. And I will end there.
No, I appreciate you dropping all of that on us today, because it's complicated, right? And there are nuances to the movement and the work, and we need to hold both those who are criminalizing our communities and our victims, as well as those who are profiting off of our communities and our victims. So I thank you for that. Key?
Yeah, I mean, I think that like everything that Emerald said is 100% real and true. I think that we have seen, especially in the Black Lives Matter movement, the amount of profiteering off of families' pain and trauma consistently, and asking folks to have to relive that. Not even asking, right? But just utilizing it as content, as generation for funds, for et cetera. And so, you know, I think that this goes to the very question, though, of what Jason was talking about and everybody else has been hinting at, of what would it look like to take the money that the NYPD does have, the $750 million that Joe Biden just gave to policing, which, you know, people say that nationally, oh, $750 million. And I'm like, New York City has $10 billion for a city. Right? We are like, people are in uproar around the 750 million. I'm just like, that is, it's nothing to New York City. That's nothing for our police officers. And so I think that accountability also goes beyond just the prosecution and just the, you know, individualization and attack of one police officer, right? It's about the system of policing in general. And we have continuously, and I think there's two things. One, there's been a very direct response as we have seen movements grow, as we have seen advocates and activists and families call for divestment from policing, to call for, you know, the reinvestment in mental health services. Example in New York City, right? Our newest mental health bill that City Council proposed is to add funding for policing and is attached to policing, right? There's this consistent rebuttal, it seems, from power holders to say, you're asking for this, we're actually going to give you the very exact opposite of what you're demanding. And that has been very frustrating. But what I also do love about this conversation and solidarity and the expansion of folks collaborating across the board and saying, we need to defund, we need to decriminalize, we need to dismantle, that this is a larger conversation across all boards, and that people are talking about it, you know, in their role and in their lane, which is very important. Speak to your own experiences, right? Like I speak to my experiences as a Black trans organizer. I don't try to speak for anybody else. I speak about my experiences as someone whose, you know, brother and father and stepfather were all incarcerated, right? So like celebrating my brother 2 years ago for getting off of parole, right? Like, let's go, let's turn up, let's celebrate for you to have that survival, right? And so I think that, you know, when it comes to defunding police and it comes to demilitarization, that there are a lot of ways in which we can look at this system and take away from it, but we also have to focus on where that funding is going and have commitments to where that funding is going, but also to be imaginative about where that funding can go and what we can do when we build together, when we collaborate together, when we look at Ms. Brooks as a grief, you know, as a grief counselor and said, like, let's actually invest, you know, money into that. But I also going back to what like Carolina says, like, it's not on the community to provide 100 community fridges. It's not on the community to do that. It's great that we are able to do that. Historically, America has had to depend on charity and mutual aid and et cetera to keep us going through. But there's more than enough money, $10 billion for police. There's more than enough money when Amazon doesn't pay any taxes at all. There's more than enough money, right, for folks to pay their fair share. And there's more than enough money. The police doesn't need any more money. They can, you know what, like, keep your tasers from 2014. It's okay. You don't need the latest taser. You know what I mean? Like, and I think about those different things and the ways in which, you know, the police response, you know, for, you know, hate crimes has been like adding 500 more police officers. It's just nobody asked for that. When it comes to pride, right? You don't need those ugly uniforms. When it comes to pride, nobody asked you for rainbow stickers on the side of your cars. Nobody asked for that. Give us the money, right? Like nobody asked for these things. And it is just a consistent way of saying that, you know, policing has taken to front and center, but also that, you know, officials are afraid to stand up to the police. And that is a whole different conversation that I think, you know, we don't have a lot of time to talk about right here and now, but there's always, I think, I'm grateful for the fact that divest to invest, defund the police, dismantling, that these are common terms now, right? That everybody is talking about it, that there's cultural awareness, like what that actually means. The last plug is that there is a defundthepolice.org website that I am not a part of, right? That's not me doing that, but it is a great source of information for all things defunding the police. And I think that when we talk about misinformation, regardless of the source of the not, if it's there and it's accurate and it's a resource, we should be able to use it. So defundthepolice.org is a resource for folks who want more information.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And as we're coming up on the end of time, I want to honor what you said about the idea that community members should not be responsible for providing services to the community. That is the government's role. You know, Frederick has been known to say that, what is it called? GoFundMe is now becoming the largest charity, filling the gap for where social services should be. And so I want to end on one last question to each and every one of you. $10 billion are going to the police. What would you want? What is one thing you want the next mayor of New York or any elected official in New York to be thinking about how to reinvest that $10 billion elsewhere? And we'll start with Jason.
Thank you. I just want to give a shout out to Coalition for Asian American Children and Families. And they're, you know, an organization among many organizations that are advocating for low-income communities, immigrant communities, communities of color, to get more resources to fund the services that our communities need. And right now they have a campaign around Budget Equity 15 and Growing campaign to fight for equitable funding. And I mentioned earlier, there are a number of different social service organizations, community-based organizations, serving different diverse populations among the Asian immigrant community, whether we're talking about Filipinos, Southeast Asians, Chinese American communities, Arab American communities. There's so many services that our community-based organizations provide: mental health services, employment, housing-related services, mental health services, DV services. There's so many services that our communities need, especially now during this pandemic, and those organizations do not get proper funding. And so I really appreciate Diane Morales' campaign. I appreciate the commitment that you've made to defund the police by $3 billion, because that is money that our communities need, not just the Asian American community, but I want to speak to that need because I think so many Asian Americans are saying, you know, we need help, we need to be seen, our people need to be safe. And I want them to understand that there are people and there are organizations that are doing this work. Not everything has to be fixed and pivoted to policing, right? We can support the organizations and the people that are already doing this work in our communities. They need support now. And so I want to just kind of connect the Defund the Police campaign to the Asian American organizations and the services that our communities need.
Anyone else? $10 billion. Frederick?
Yeah, you know, $10 billion speaks, I mean, $1 billion, any amount of money really of that scale speaks directly to what everyone on here has already said. You know, I'm thinking about the things that Emerald was saying on this call, and they're unfathomable, right? Absolutely unfathomable. And my mind goes directly to UBI, right? A universal basic income, for instance. There's no excuse why we should have to fundraise as a community for the basic things that all of us should have. There should be no reason why people are begging for aid from a government in which we are essentially extorted, right? You know, we conditioned our society, not just as New York City, but as a nation, that our money should all go to hammers and therefore everything looks like a nail, right? All we are taught is violence. And if we reinvest in radical imagining what we can do with money, we can invest in healthcare, we can invest in housing, we can invest in the starving children right here on our streets. When I walk down the street to Queensbridge, so you know that $10 billion, give Diane $1 billion of it, give Diane $2 billion of it. I'm sure that you can figure out some things to do, but I do think that a universal basic income is what my mind consistently comes back to, and it speaks directly to what Carolina spoke about with the barbacks at her job. It's what Emerald spoke directly about. It's what Pastor speaks about in terms of this not being a sanctuary city for most people. It's what everyone spoken about on here, right? We don't need more guns. We don't need rainbow stickers on military vehicles. What we need is a survival, frankly.
Thank you. Emerald, you have your hand up?
Yeah, $10 billion, I could think of about 3 things right now that's major important. I think that some of those funds should go independently into the New York City Department of Education, so that the Department of Education can bring in social justice people to work on Black history projects, Black history education, Black history empowerment. We should have somebody who would come into the Department of Education and create a curriculum for Black education. And we should work with the Department of Education to include some of those things, because for me, social justice, for me, the civil rights movement, that is what it's called, not the Black Lives Matter movement. How I learned is that the social justice movement was the civil rights movement. It was renamed, although we know that all Black Lives Matter, the gist of it is that it's the civil rights movement. And I think that we should educate the children on the evolution, because a lot of people are miseducated about the Black Panther Party. A lot of things that I'm learning about the Black Panther Party is a lot of miseducation that I received in school. So I think that we should have more Black and brown educators that are independently funded to go into these schools, because when you then now have to follow the curriculum of the Department of Education, there's a lot of things that you cannot do. I think that that's number one. That's education in public schools for the youth. And then number 2, we need to focus on taking some of that money and putting it into the foster care system. Right now, when a person is removed from their home and they go into a new home, they're with this new family, they don't receive mental health services right away. They don't receive mental health services until the foster parent deemed them mentally ill and needed to get social services. So I think that a lot of people in activist community are foster children, are former foster children, or have been in contact with people who are foster youth. And I think that there's a need for their support, because just like you lose a family member to a police brutality situation, you lose your family member when you go into foster care. You lose your family when you go into foster care, and now you with this contract family that you don't know. And sometimes it's not a safe situation. So a lot of that funding can go towards retraining foster parents and to support the children who are in those foster homes. And the last thing is to, have some of that money go into such social justice programs on a street level. So a lot of the organizations that aren't doing the right things with the funding, they should be definitely defunded, and those funds should be reallotted to agencies that are doing the work. So a lot of the times, there'll be a great program, or there'll be a great idea or a great situation, and a person like me who is not on the business side, who doesn't have investors, I don't know how to find that funding. So I think that having those resources to put back into the community on the street level and bringing it back into educating the youth, because they are the next upcoming police officers, doctors, lawyers, and we want to encourage them to want to be those, and want to be elected officials, want to change the laws, and want to tap into their talents, because social justice can be supported in many ways. Like, you don't have to just protest. You don't have to just, march. You don't have to just get arrested. That's not only social justice. You can be a lawmaker. You can be a campaign manager. You can, become a police officer. You can work community relations in the police station. And I think that a lot of that money can go into retraining police officers, because I think that if I go into police training and I sit there with them, it'll be a different dynamic, as opposed to somebody that's like, somebody that went to school for communication and now they're sitting in a cultural sensitivity training. If I conducted the cultural sensitivity training, it would be like, whoa, my colleague killed your father, and now you're here educating me on cultural sensitivity in your neighborhoods, in your communities. So if I was the person that was going around retraining police officers, I think that the atmosphere and the tone would be a little different, as opposed to these people who are just going to school, learning from a textbook, and then going into these police stations and training the officers. So those are my 3 things that I think that the money should go to. I do have a long list, but I'm just going to stop there. And that's basically what I wanted to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Emerald. We have a little bit of time, but I want to get Linda and Rohan. So Rohan, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to just quickly say, we can no longer profit off of Asian death. We can no longer profit by calling for policing of communities. When communities of color, when we call for more policing, what we're doing is actually affirming the model minority myth that policing works for Asian communities, but not Black and other communities of color. To give a few examples, in this city, we are looking at how ICE actually targets primarily Asian American communities. The most impacted communities currently in this city by ICE are Chinese communities. Jason had earlier listed Angelo Quinto and Christian Hall. I'm going to add to those names Bon Kamphone Sivan, Sarspai Patel, Hussein Shehada, Jennifer Laude, a trans Filipino woman. And so I think when we do that, we are wherever that money needs to go, we need to dismantle this erasure of the history of how these systems have actually been made very unsafe for our communities. So I think moving forward with that kind of a budget reallocation, we have to bear in mind the long history of the erasure of these traumatic systems of exploitation of our communities. We also need to make sure that everything we do are going to be accessible to all persons, not just for those of us on this panel, but also for folks who are struggling with housing security. Carolina mentioned a lot of people who are struggling with that right now. And so with that, I think we need to create systems of safety, as Jason put it, systems of safety that come from a place of care and can envision a community of care rather than a community of capital. That's all.
Thank you. Linda?
I just wanted to say, Diane, I need you to spend the $10 billion on everything but policing. There's plenty of things in New York that we need to be investing our money in, from education to healthcare to actual affordable housing for people who affordable is a different definition, as you know, for us than it is for the people making affordable housing. And I just wanted to say thank you for creating this space for us in this conversation that's really important. And I just wanted to reiterate one more time to my fellow Asian family that I'm here in solidarity. Please feel free to call upon us. You know, sometimes we also need to continue to learn. I'm still a student of solidarity. What does it look like to be in solidarity with Asian communities? What do you need us to do? Where do you need us to show up? What do you need us to say? Who do you need us to hold accountable? We're here to follow your lead in this moment. And I hope that this conversation gave you some solitude that you're not alone, that we are here with you. We are other marginalized people that know this pain. Your community knows this pain, and we're going to get through this together. And so I appreciated this conversation. I'm very honored to have been here.
Thank you, Linda. Yes, allyship is a lifelong journey that we're all on every single day. With that being said, it was a pleasure moderating this discussion. I'm now going to turn it over to Diane, her amazing team, for putting this event together, to close us out with final remarks.
Thanks, Jamira, so much. I just want to, first of all, I want to thank my team for pulling this together in lightning speed, time, and just beautifully. I want to thank all of you, each and every one of you. I want to make one comment on this funding thing, right? The one thing I want to say about this is, the austerity, we've been living in a time where there's a lot of talk about austerity budget and all of the problems with the budget, and yet all of a sudden, when it came to policing, there was no problem with the budget, right? And so the need for us to recognize that one of the instruments of division and ongoing control that our government uses to divide our communities and to control our communities is this policing issue, right? And so absolutely, we need to move towards a system that systematically and progressively defunds the police and invests in our communities. That's, you know, that's my comment on like, what are we going to do with this money? There's plenty of it that we can do with this money. And also it starts with recognizing how the money is used and when the money is made available and for what purpose. I want to thank you all for being here in solidarity today and modeling both in conversation, I think, and through your actions, what is possible when we begin to bridge these gaps and are unapologetic about what it is we believe is right for our communities and what it is that our communities need in terms of overcoming the structural and systemic barriers of oppression and injustice that continue to be imposed on our communities. I am deeply grateful to stand with all of you today, and I look forward to what it is that we can do together to create a new New York City that is not built on anything historic or anything that we have known, but is built on our dreams and our imaginations as to what it is that we can do together. So deeply appreciative of all of you for all of your sharing, for your time, for your energy, and for the role that you play in the movement. I believe in us, I believe in what's possible, and I look forward to creating a new reality for us and for our communities together. So thank you. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon. Be safe and well. Be blessed.